Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jason Lichty. I am the Senior Environmental Project Coordinator with the Broward County Environmental Protection and Growth Management Department. And it's my honor and privilege today to serve as the moderator for this panel, Justice, Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity in Disaster Management and Adaptation. I'm just going to say a few opening remarks, introduce our panelists briefly, and then they will each take 10 minutes to talk to us. Then we'll take a short break and open up for a question and answer period. I may ask a couple of questions to start with, but there's a interactive question service that you'll be able to use, as well as just putting questions into the GoToWebinar question box. So let's get started. No matter our individual fields, whether it's climate action, disaster preparedness and recovery, or emergency management or something else, at their core, these activities should protect and enhance the health, safety, and well-being of people. Unfortunately, throughout history, communities of color and low-income people have often been ignored, discriminated against, or severely under-resourced. These historical injustices still permeate our systems today and deny people their proper place at the table and their proper share of programs, funding, and respect. We simply have to have an honest accounting of these disparities and to take action to rectify them. Obviously, we'll only be able to scratch the surface of these topics today, but I think those scratches will be pretty deep since we're very fortunate to have 6 experts on tap with extensive knowledge of how justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion have or have not been part of emergency preparedness, climate adaptation, and disaster recovery in the past and present, and how and why things need to change moving forward. On our panel today are Chauncey Willis, co-founder and CEO of the Institute for Diversity and Inclusion in Emergency Management; Ariadna Gaudreau-Aubert, founder and executive director of Ayuda Legal Puerto Rico; Myra Cruz, climate justice director for Catalyst Miami; Andy Anderson, disaster recovery advocate for Disability Rights North Carolina; John Cooper, assistant vice president for public partnership and outreach and director of the Texas Target Communities at Texas A&M University; and Louis Rivers, associate professor in the Department of Forestry and Environmental Resources at North Carolina State University. So without further ado, let me turn things over to Chauncey to get us started.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I am delighted to be here today. Once again, my name is Chauncey Willis, and I am a career emergency manager. Over 22 years in the field of emergency management, and also a certified cultural diversity expert. So I'm thrilled to be here today to discuss these important topics, and also to provide any answers to pressing questions that may come up. Our mission for the Institute for Diversity and Inclusion in Emergency Management is really to increase diverse representation within the field, as well as reduce the negative impacts of disaster on women, people of color, and the underserved, marginalized groups that are most susceptible to disasters. The vision of IDEM is to enhance global resilience and improve disaster outcomes by leveraging diversity, equity, and inclusion. So our organization essentially leads efforts to understand and assess equity in disasters, and we do that for disaster-related organizations and anyone who may be in an allied organization. So my role here today is really to discuss and promote equity in decision-making, policy development, programming, and planning. IDEM believes there is a real need to achieve equity in all areas of emergency management and resilience building. So how is that done? Well, it's done by understanding what equity is and what it is not, and then intentionally operationalizing it. So today I'd like to tell you a little bit about how to operationalize equity and also provide the difference between equality and equity, because yes, there is a difference. There's a quote that I love, and it's by a philosopher named Dasani, and it says, equality is giving everyone a shoe, equity is giving everyone a shoe that fits. And I use this quote often during speaking engagements because I believe it's important to understand the difference between equity and equality, especially as it relates to the field of emergency management. These two concepts are very different, inherently different, and as such, they produce different outcomes. So I'm going to give a brief overview of equity and equality and some examples. Equity is about understanding the need of those you serve and applying their perspective in solution building. So in times of disaster, diversity and equity become critical and must be operationalized. People who lack diversity in perspective cannot develop equitable policies or perform equitable planning, nor create equitable programs that will benefit rather than harm our most vulnerable groups and communities. It's about the people and understanding the needs of the people. So within the field of emergency management, there are some things that we know for sure based on data. Number one, the field of emergency management is led by white males to the tune of over 82% in positions of leadership. Number two, the people that are most likely to be impacted by disasters are those who have been marginalized and who are underserved, not white males. And so we have to address that. Now, equality, what is equality? Equality focuses on sameness or uniformity in approach to find a solution. For example, I'm a mom, I have a 5-year-old, and we are taught as children, because I teach my son this, the importance of equality or sameness. Now, if he had siblings and one sibling wanted a piece of candy, I would provide them both with a piece of candy. And that represents equality because every child is in the same location to receive the candy. They both have access to me, and all would be satisfied by receiving the same or similar type of candy. That's equality, not equity. So diversity and equity are interconnected. To appreciate equity, we must also understand diversity or differences. Diversity produces equity because different perspectives and experiences are considered, are respected, and they're incorporated in solution building. Now, uniformity of approach or doing the most for the most cannot produce equity because sameness, uniformity, it lacks diversity in perspective and experience. So equity acknowledges that people are diverse and have different needs, and therefore does not seek one solution as an answer to the needs of many. Achieving equity requires understanding that everyone is not starting in the same place. Everyone doesn't have access to the same resources, and everyone does not have the same life experiences. Therefore, one solution can never address everyone's needs. Equity is a continuous process that requires understanding the needs of those you're serving and then applying their perspective in solution building. So in times of disaster, diversity and equity become critical. People who lack diverse perspective will not be producing the most equitable programs, plans, and policies. So for example, say there's a major tornado or flood that occurs in a city in America. And during the disaster, a group of very similar decision makers, let's say it's all white males or a same group of similar type people, maybe not even based on race or ethnicity. They come together to make a decision to assist those who've been impacted by the tornado. And they decide that they're going to provide a disaster recovery center. All of these people in the group drive cars and they have access to personal transportation. And their assumption is that because they have personal transportation and everyone they know has personal transportation, then having a car is something that everyone has. And as a result, they establish a disaster recovery center that is well outside of any public transit route. Unfortunately, those who are most impacted by that disaster do not have personal vehicles, and their assumptions were wrong. And therefore, those people most impacted by the disaster cannot benefit from the available resources, and their recovery is impeded and is a longer recovery cycle. So those decision makers created an inequitable response, and now it has to be corrected. So that's an example of an inequitable policy that benefits those who already have access. They already have access to recovery resources. And that policy, that one decision, failed to serve those who are most vulnerable and those who are in need of the most. So the enemy of equity is the failure to acknowledge existing inequities. Cultivating equity in any realm requires first understanding the existing inequities that are at play. Too often, organizations will determine the need for increased equity, and they'll be right. But then they will fail to approach the solution armed with diversity of thought and representation. And they will fail to acknowledge societal imbalances that create the need for additional equity measures in the first place. So it's kind of like putting a brand new blanket over a pothole and then trying to convince everyone that the new blanket will solve the core problem of a failing infrastructure system. Real life does not, and it will not, has not ever worked that way. The pothole is still there under the blanket. We must address the problem with well-thought, data-driven solutions. When diversity is absent, so is equity. And that's a huge problem for a field like emergency management that prides itself on helping people in need before, during, and after a disaster. So I believe by understanding the differences between equality and equity, emergency managers will be better positioned to create more equitable plans and programs. And I'll stop there. Thank you for your time.
A wonderful introduction. So next up is Ariadna.
Hello, everyone, and thank you all for having me here. My name is Ariadna Godro, and I'm the founder and executive director of Ayuda Legal Puerto Rico, a nonprofit that has been working with legal empowerment and disaster legal aid since day one after Hurricane Maria, major Hurricane Maria, hit the island in 2017. This is our 7th year working as a legal empowerment and advocacy organization. This is our 4th year as a nonprofit. And most of the work that we have done, providing legal accompaniment to people affected by disasters, also has had to do with advocacy, with developing policies that address specifically equity, and also the question of who is left behind when recovery is unfair. So I wanted to start maybe just by saying that as human rights lawyers, we know that disaster response is characterized by narratives that often has to do with charity and victimhood. Efforts often are directed to immediate response, immediate needs. And once the attention diminishes because the media loses interest, because there has been another disaster elsewhere, or because so much time has passed, survivors are left to fend by themselves. To fend by themselves with long-term consequences of disasters, but also with long-term consequences of unjust recovery. Recovery that promotes and fosters inequitable development, that fosters displacements, that fosters disaster capitalisms, and it hinders the rights of specific populations in Puerto Rico. In this case, it's also low-income populations, but it also has to do with the fact that Puerto Rico as a whole has been affected by inequitable policies that are worsening the already fragile social, political, and economic conditions of a colony. When we are working on the ground, Ayuda Legal Puerto Rico and other stakeholders, we have developed a framework, and we call it the Just Recovery Framework. And this framework has been very useful to accompany people after disasters like hurricanes, earthquake, and now the pandemic. And basically, that framework says that people have a right for just recovery to account for the needs, the wants, and also about their human rights. So the Just Recovery Framework says people are not victims, they are right holders. Recovery is a long-term process, and those more affected by disasters need to have spaces of agency. They need to be able not only to repair their house, but also to have a say in the way of how the land, how the housing will look when we are talking about resiliency, when we are talking about recovery. So in that sense, just to provide a very broad context of what Puerto Rico is undergoing right now, we are receiving some of the largest allocations of recovery funds. We are receiving nearly $9.7 billion in CDBG-DR funds. Those are funds for long-term recovery. And we're also receiving $8.3 billion in MIT funds, CDBG MIT funds. So what we're seeing is a huge influx of money, but that still lacks a perspective of equitable development. So these action plans, or the way that these funds are being planned and are being used in the land in Puerto Rico, which by definition is a limited piece of land in the middle of the Caribbean, lacks a perspective based on race, based on gender, based on the question of who is left behind in the processes of recovery. Things that we saw back when FEMA came to Puerto Rico right after Hurricane Maria, we're seeing them once again. Discrimination against very specific groups like people with informal titles, which in Puerto Rico is common because nothing in the local law requires people to have a legal document to prove ownership. And that has to do with cultural ties, but also to the way that Puerto Ricans have related to their soil, to their land, to their housing. That scheme, that cultural way of dealing, of having a relationship of ownership with the land, of belonging, was disrupted when FEMA came to Puerto Rico and decided that 60% of applicants had no right to receive assistance because they lacked a legal document. We're seeing those same barriers to equitable access to funding in CDBG MIT. We're seeing them also in CDBG DR. And the consequence is that you have huge populations, particularly historically marginalized people like Black communities, low-income communities, people living in flood zones, which accounts for more than 300,000 houses in Puerto Rico, that are not only going to be receiving assistance, but they are going to be part of a huge experiment of trying to integrate barriers to repair and rebuild in flood zone, not because there is a climate justice perspective, not because there's a concern for climate change and sea level rises, but because there is a planning process that has to do with removing poor communities from coastal places, and at the same time offering those places as an alternative for hotels, for opportunity zones, which in the case of Puerto Rico is 98% of the land, and offering it for foreign investors to invest money. So what we're seeing, and what Ayuda Legal has been saying for these last 3 years, is that inequitable recovery, it's also a part of a planned process of dispossession. When a disaster strikes, COVID, pandemics, hurricanes, tornadoes, fire, people are dispossessed of their bodies, their bodily integrity. Who gets first aid, who gets assistance, who gets shelter? It's a decision, a policy-based decision that is grounded on the way that people are embodied, based on race, based on gender, based on class, based on age and mobility. It also has to do with the way that inequitable development dispossesses people from housing. Who gets to be relocated? Who gets to have funding for repairs? Who gets to have to rebuild a house? But lastly, it dispossesses people from the land. And in the case of Puerto Rico, in the last 10 years, that has resulted in 15% of the population leaving the island. So when we're speaking about a human rights-based approach, and this is something so that we can go to I don't want to extend myself, it has to do with developing a human rights-based perspective to elements not only about participation, about transparency, about corporate accountability for, and I'm talking about the companies that are being contracted and hired to make the recovery process, but it also has to do with the way that we are defining climate justice, you know, in the context of disasters. Climate change is real. The consequences of climate change are ever present, and in an island, and probably way more than in other places. But just as a few people are going to be surviving the climate crisis if we don't develop a human rights-based approach to climate justice that has to do with the fact that we need human rights-based relocations, that we need sensible relocations, that we also need to deal with the fact that sometimes people don't have elsewhere to move. So we need to be developing adaptation and mitigation options that are sensible to those conditions of inequality. A few people are going also to be surviving climate justice. So I think that equity in terms of recovery, and I'm going to close with this, has to do with a transversal process that ends up with placing survivors, placing right holders at the middle of the conversation of recovery. It's the only way ahead. So I want to leave it here and thank you all for the space.
Thanks very much, Ariadna. It's excellent start. I'm sure we'll come back to some of those topics. Next up is Myra. Take it away, Myra.
Great, thank you, everyone. I'm so happy to be here with you all virtually. So my name is Myra Cruz. I'm the Climate Justice Director with Catalyst Miami. So I'll start off with just providing a quick background about who we are and the work that we do. So Catalyst Miami, we're based in Miami-Dade County. We are a nonprofit organization that primarily aims to improve the health and well-being of low, middle wealth communities, which are typically communities of color here in Miami. So for the last several years, we've been increasingly working more in the climate justice space. We recognize that the communities that we are serving with our services that revolve around financial aid, for example, and building people's literacy around finances and increasing healthcare access, that work that we're doing, the communities that we're working with, they're the ones that are being most impacted by climate change. So it became really imperative for us to work in the space to really address the systemic issues that people are dealing with. There's a lot of overlap there. So as you probably know, in Miami, we do have a lot of issues that impact us that relate to climate change. The most often noted ones are, of course, we're dealing with sea level rise. We do also have very active hurricane season here. We have sunny day flooding or king tide flooding. We have extreme heat issues here as well. So the list goes on and on. But I wanted to also kind of use a case study to illustrate where equity fell short and kind of what I would have done differently. So last year, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers released this study called the Back Bay Study. For short, it has a much longer name. It was this ridiculously long document that illustrated how they were proposing to address the issue of storm surge here in Miami-Dade. So it's a $4.6 billion investment as of now. Of course, this is just the first stage of it. There'll be more iterations of this, more planning to come. But what it boils down to currently, as the plan stands, is that it would, they're suggesting that we build walls along the coastline that could be as high as 13 feet tall. When this plan came out, it immediately raised a lot of red flags for many different reasons among community-based groups like ours, others that work in conservation, home building associations, you name it, everyone had issues with it. So some of the things that were really apparent is that this study only sought to address storm surge. It wasn't really taking into account sea level rise or climate change impacts of that nature. So that was one major red flag for us. It also proposed setting aside a large chunk of money to elevate homes, but as you may or may not be aware, the way that these calculations are done to figure out who should benefit from these programs tend to benefit higher property values. So that usually means that's in higher income areas that probably, when we're talking about equity, shouldn't be the ones that are prioritized when it comes to a study of this nature. So it started to raise a lot of equity questions. And last year especially, you know, we moved online because of the pandemic. So when it came to outreach that the Army Corps was doing, it was all online, but it wasn't targeted. The proposal, you know, very clearly stated the communities that these walls would go up in, but there wasn't any targeted outreach in these specific communities to alert them, hey, like, this is what we're thinking. What do you think of this? Would you want to see these 13-foot tall walls in your community? So it started to raise a lot of questions for many groups. And of course, a lot of us spoke up during those meetings, but I use this just to kind of illustrate how you have outside experts that come into a community proposing something, and then there's immediate backlash. And there's a reason for that, because there wasn't as much community engagement as we would have liked to see, where there was targeted communication, where they were using partnerships on the ground with groups like ours that work on these issues. So there was a world where we could have partnered with the Army Corps and brought in our members and have very dedicated discussions to this in order to address some of these issues before they even came up. As well, you know, we do a lot of outreach with our community members. We have different leadership programs that hopefully I'll get to talk more about later in the question section, but we have a climate leadership training program that we provide, and a housing justice training program that we provide for free for community members, in which they learn about the issues, they learn the jargon. We ensure that they walk away having a better understanding of these two pretty complicated topics. And the main goal is for them to walk away feeling empowered and having the tools and the advocacy skills that they need to advocate for what they want to see in their community. It's our way of kind of shifting the paradigm and ensuring that community members really have the power to make the change that they want to see, to increase the resilience in their neighborhoods, in their communities, and in their backyards. And so, just to say that, you know, when you have programs like those in place, it can create a really powerful movement in which you have people that are attuned to what's going on. And not only that, what we've seen when we have people come through these programs and when we talk to them, we've had focus groups before, and we've asked them, what do you want to see when it comes to climate change issues in your community? What are the solutions that you want to see? And across the board, what we hear is, we want green infrastructure. We don't want to see more concrete. We don't want to see walls going up. So we already knew before the Army Corps came in to propose this study what community members wanted to see. They've told us many times before, and we're not the only group that's done that kind of outreach before. And so it just really starts to illustrate how people's lived expertise, the experiences that they go through, there's a lot of expertise to go around here on the ground. I think oftentimes when you have outside researchers come in, that's the kind of power dynamics that you have to deal with. And I think one of the things I want you all to walk away with after being a part of this panel is that it's really important to uplift that. I think we often rely on people who have PhDs and master's degrees to tell us like what we need in our own communities, but you'd be amazed what people see when they've been living somewhere for several years and going through these changes for years and years. They really do know what they want to see, what changes they want to see in their communities. And so those are just some of the things that we found going through this Back Bay study that was proposed last year. We're definitely hoping to see some changes proposed to that, because if you think about the amount of that they're suggesting, it's $5 billion. That's a lot you could do with that here. And there's a lot of communities in need that have never received that much attention or investment due to a number of issues that the previous speakers have already talked about. But yeah, there's a history of inequality here that really builds into all of these systems. And so I think if you're considering ways to get at that, I think leadership programs like the ones that we provide are a great way to turn that on its head and really create a powerful group of people that are now aware about what's going on in their backyard. They can put a name to it. They can call it climate change. They can call it gentrification, whatever it may be, and really putting people in positions of power, just like Ariana was saying, where they're in the middle of a conversation, so that they really have autonomy over what's going on. It doesn't make sense to have someone who's never lived in Miami to say, hey, I want to put a wall up in your community. That's not the way to go about these things. So I'll just leave you all with that, some food for thought. But thank you all so much for this opportunity. I'm excited to answer your questions in the next portion of this.
Thanks so much, Myra. Look forward to more conversation with you. So next up is Andy Anderson. Take it away, Andy.
Hello, everybody. I'm Andy Anderson. I'm from a little town called Whiteville, North Carolina. And I guess I'm going to I've learned a lot. So I'm glad that folks went before me, and I wish I would have went before them and not followed all that information, because they've said so much. So I'm going to just kind of switch gears off of my notes a little bit, and I'm going to talk about kind of intersections. Because as I listened to our previous presenters, I thought about the many intersections that I ran into. So I'm going to use kind of a personal story that I'm in a town called Whiteville. We're probably about 200 feet above sea level. My house is flooded like 3 times. My mom's house is now gutted from a previous storm where she had to spend about $20,000 to get the mold out of her house. I grew up here on the wrong side of the tracks. I was in a segregated school. When we integrated, I was placed as an African-American male, was placed in the slow learners class. And so through those traumas that we had coming up, I had various bouts with depression. And so now I work with a company, working with an organization with Disability Rights North Carolina, who is actually, we're advocacy. We provide advocacy and protections for people with disabilities. I didn't think that I would be a consumer, but at the same time, I was building a company that was providing services for people with disabilities throughout the state of North Carolina. Ended up, I think, being about the 3rd largest provider. I became CEO of that company while secretly getting services from the providers I hired, the psychiatrists, to make sure that I didn't commit suicide. So the intersections of this that I'm dealing with as far as disabilities are concerned, as we advocate for people with disabilities, my fellow citizens are plentiful. In North Carolina, we are been trying to work with bringing more people to the table, and because while we were trying to recover from storms, we found out as we investigated, our organization investigated during the storm, that even in the recovery efforts, we saw so many challenges, so many problems. When we went into shelters and we found discrimination against people with disabilities, segregation with people with disabilities. And we wrote a report called Storm After the Storm. That was picked up by Red Cross, and Red Cross funded us to do a disaster recovery and resiliency piece in disability rights for the state of North Carolina. In that, we've been monitoring shelters and giving solutions. We've also tried to modify how we did shelters and actually working with North Carolina disaster recovery and doing it a different way, and making sure that we try to stay away from congregate settings, because congregate settings were traumatic for people of color, for people with disabilities. And so there's that intersectionality again. So we partnered to try to change those pieces. We've also found that when we're providing services in general, that we had a lot of insensitivities as far as culture is concerned, or what we call sometimes cultural competence, that people were treated differently. And we, as an organization, decided to provide trauma-informed care training for our allies that we gathered and tried to put together and find some common ground on making sure that we were more informed about how to treat people in their lowest and most vulnerable times. One of the things that I did is when we joined the organization, I recognized that we needed to do a self-assessment. We were out working in communities, finding out that, the historically marginalized people were living in the same places that you've heard earlier. We're in the lowlands. We had the most vulnerable infrastructure living in, we live in North Carolina, a lot of trailer homes, and the same folks are living in these homes that have multiple problems with health, with vulnerable, income levels. So now exposed to a pandemic, so things are become just layered, and so then comes a storm. Well, while we were looking at that and working with folks, we became more and more informed on the street, if you would, about the multiple levels of devastation these people had already experienced. And then when we looked at our own infrastructure, and I noticed as the new kid on the block coming in last January, that I looked around the table and then all our directors were Ken and Barbies. All of our directors were white people in a place that we're supposed to be advocating outside for equity and diversity and all of these things. We had all white directors. So inside, we formed a People of Color Caucus, and we said that if we're going to be in integrity, going out in the community, doing anything, advocating for policy in the legislature, talking to the governor's office, and matter of fact, we're having the authority to actually litigate against people who were discriminating, and we had all Ken and Barbies. So we had to do something different. We pulled together, we got everybody, internally to read Me and White Supremacy, so that we could learn a little bit more about ourselves and how we were inwardly facing each other out of sorts. So there was no way that we could outwardly face and be effective and also be in integrity. And let me tell you, you guys who've been working on the street know that people can smell a fake or a phony or a lack of integrity when you go into the community and you walk in the mud and walk through the devastation. And so some of the challenges are, I think, as organizations, that we need to check ourselves and make sure subsequently, we hired a consultant to come in and tell us about ourselves so that we could understand diversity and inclusion internally. Because we were looking at where it was mentioned earlier, we had the same blanket demographic making decisions for people who had a totally different experience. And so we embarked upon that. One of the other things that we did is that we decided to be a liaison between those people who can spit acronyms out in their sleep to the folks who are leaders on the street. And so what we did is we took information, which we translated that information into pamphlets and conversations that could be had at the local level. We sought out sororities, we sought out fraternities, we sought out leaders And what we call those leaders, we call them host champions. They were already champions socially, and they were champions civically in their various communities. But what we needed is some allies we needed allies on the street. We call them host champions. We trained them about disaster response and recovery and resiliency. And also we had some discussions about equity and those kinds of things. And we went community to community, to churches, especially to sororities. We found out in this last election how powerful AKA would be without vice president if we went to those folks and we activated those folks and the power they already have, the connection they already have in their community. So we took the information that we sit around tables with in Raleigh, and we made sure that we went to champions and host champions and developed and got resources to those folks, because we don't have a resource problem. What we have is a distribution problem. So I'll leave it with that.
Thanks so much, Andy. You shouldn't have closed with that, because I want to write that down and instead I have to talk again. Thank you so much. Next up is John. It's all yours, John.
All right, thank you, Jason. And I want to share with you some deeper insights into my background. Thank you for inviting me, first of all, by the way. But I want to share some deeper insights with you into my background and perspective on where I think we are in the evolution of planning, disaster planning, with regard to diversity, equity, and inclusion. But first, I can't express how excited I am to have this conversation with this kind of group. About 25 years ago, I was finishing up my second year in the PhD program in the Department of City and Regional Planning at UNC Chapel Hill. And I was planning to write a dissertation on the topic of equity and disaster planning. And I was inspired to write that dissertation because after spending a couple years volunteering with environmental justice groups and a couple years working as a planner with the North Carolina Division of Emergency Management, I had concluded that there was no such thing as a natural disaster. As an EJ volunteer, I saw how people of color were disproportionate share of environmental hazards due mainly to the forces of discrimination and segregation. As an emergency management professional, I recognized some of those patterns that Chauncey talked about, how people of color, and Andy talked about this too, how people of color tend to be concentrated in low quality housing and low-lying areas where the land was cheap. And this was true particularly in the South, where for decades during Jim Crow, Black people could own land, but they couldn't own good land, right? They had to be relegated to land in the floodplains and on the other side of the tracks, as Andy would say. And the story of Princeville, North Carolina is a clear example of this phenomenon. I'm sure many of you have probably heard about the story of Princeville. One of the speakers yesterday talked about it. It's one of the oldest surviving, if not the oldest surviving town in the U.S. that was incorporated by former slaves, and they established it right on the bank of the Tar River in the floodplain on land no one else wanted because it wasn't really suitable for farming. And Princeville made national news in 1999 after it was devastated by Hurricane Floyd. And because of its historical significance, President Clinton named a special commission for the redevelopment of Princeville. And I mentioned that. Actually, I was designated a liaison to that committee by the director of the North Carolina Division of Emergency Management. I was recommended by my old friend Gavin Smith. Gavin actually hired me at the North Carolina Division of Emergency Management, but that's a story for another time. Anyway, the chair of the Princeville Redevelopment Commission was U.S. Representative Eva Clayton. And I mentioned that because at the time, Eva Clayton was also a member of the Congressional Black Caucus. And the Congressional Black Caucus was also aware, had become aware of that pattern of disproportionate impact on people of color. And they wanted to do something about it. They actually tried to get some money appropriated after Hurricane Floyd to study the phenomenon, but they weren't able to because by then the 2000 presidential election was in full swing. And then in 2001, we had the attacks on the World Trade Center. So our nation's focus kind of shifted away from disaster planning more to preventing terrorist attacks, protecting the homeland. 2003, after Hurricane Isabel struck Dare County, I believe, someone correct me, they got the money. In 2004, FEMA put out a call for proposals to launch the Emergency Preparedness Demonstration Project. I was on the team that got that project, and we started work on the Emergency Preparedness Demonstration in July of 2005. And of course, Katrina made landfall in August of 2005. And the first thing I thought was that, I was glad that I didn't change career paths. But yeah, I'll say more about the emergency preparedness demonstration in the question segment if people want to hear more about it. But with the time I have left, I want to zero in more on how much I believe things have changed as disaster plan practices, Katrina, and where I hope we are headed in the future. So after my time in Princeville, I went back to complete my dissertation. And one of the things I learned in the course of writing the literature review for that dissertation was that the people who studied disasters had known for decades, well, maybe not decades, but for years about the disproportionate impact of disasters on people of color and the lack of equity considerations and relief and recovery. And what happened to Princeville wasn't new or rare. In fact, Princeville had flooded about 9 times before, and I think it's flooded a couple times since. Somebody correct me on that too. But before Princeville, there was Hurricane Andrew. In 1992, my friend and colleague Walt Peacock wrote a book about ethnicity and gender in disasters in Hurricane Andrew, which struck Black and brown communities where Myra is around Miami-Dade. Before Hurricane Andrew, I read how Black people were mistreated after a tornado struck Wichita Falls, Texas in 1979. So, I cited this book in my dissertation. And I don't want to go down that rabbit hole either. If you just Google racism and the Great Mississippi Flood, the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927, or search the stories about how Black people fared after the 1906 earthquake, I think you'll find that was a time when Black lives mattered so little that they weren't even counted in the death numbers, after those kinds of disasters. So again, Princeville, it wasn't unique. It was just the first time that level of suffering and inequity and injustice was publicly connected to systemic racism in the U.S. and broadcast live nightly on television. And the second time, of course, was Hurricane Katrina. Again, before Katrina, outside of the Congressional Black Caucus and a few kind of scholars, very few people were thinking about how to address diversity, equity, and inclusion in disasters. And so one of the reasons why I'm excited to talk to you today is because you are my tribe, right? You are the people that I've been waiting on. But we still have work to do. Now we're 15 years after Katrina. And although the lack of equity is commonly accepted, and we know a little bit more about what equity and just recovery look like, but it seems like collectively we still struggle with how to catalyze that vision. Today professional planners have all kinds of sophisticated tools to show where vulnerable populations are, but still too many of them lack the commitment and competency to find out who they are, right? What are their names? What challenges do they face? What knowledge, skills, or abilities can they invest in their own recovery and the sustainability of their own communities? For my dissertation, back to that, I content analyzed a national sample of local flood mitigation plans. And I was looking for evidence of the choices planners made to address diversity, equity, inclusion. And I wanted to know who they invited to the table, where their meetings were held, at the courthouse, community center, church. If it's at a church, what denomination? Okay, was the space accessible for people in wheelchairs? Those kind of questions. I wanted to know what communication channels they used to solicit and or share information. Did they put announcements in utility bills or country radio? I mean, I love Merle Haggard and George Jones, but if I wanted to reach a diverse audience, I got to think outside the box on that. Did you put the local ad in the newspaper? Did you run that ad on Christmas Eve? I've got stories, anecdotes about all these, about how engagement goes wrong. Did you run a Spanish version? Okay. I wanted to know how they prioritize strategies. Were they aimed at addressing past inequities? And so Unfortunately, to my surprise, not to my surprise, I didn't find a whole lot of equity in that content analysis of plans. I looked at 70 plans across the country, and most I found was less than 30 instances was in about 7 or 8 plans in 4 states: Washington, California, North Carolina, and Florida, where they have history of hazards and some culture of planning. So as a result, and in light of my own experiences, this is more about what Chanti was saying. I concluded that even when emergency managers believe in the value of equity and inclusion, it's not something that they're good at, right? And things got a little better after Katrina. There was a lot of buzz around the notion of whole community planning, but it was still too abstract, right? It was still easier said than demonstrated. And there was still some skepticism on the part of the people with badges who were, again, mostly white, male, ex-military, trained in top-down models of leadership development, not this humanitarian stuff that one of our other speakers were talking about. So it wasn't something that they were keen to do. And then a couple years after Katrina, I was engaged in another effort to gauge the attitudes of planners on diversity and inclusion in the process. And we discovered that the planners were worried about a lot of things that, in my experience, they didn't need to be worried about, about whether or not it'd be dominated by special interests, whether or not it would delay the process. I've got a whole list of things, Jason, that looks like you want me to wrap up. I won't go over it. If people want to know more about them, I can say more about them. But I do need to make this point. Okay, so now that we're on board with what equity and justice looks like, I'd like to see more mastery of community building on the part of professionals. That require a range of skills, including the ability to recruit and engage diverse constituencies, the ability to diagnose issues that hinder meaningful participation, all right, the ability to respect indigenous knowledge, to accommodate different learning styles, to acknowledge historical and cultural contexts, to mediate disputes, and to frame a range of value positions for different stakeholders. So let me just make this last point, okay, Jason? All right. The short story is people think stuff is easy, but there's a methodology to it, right? It's steeped in the experiences of skilled process facilitators and seasoned community organizers. Those who do it, like Chantier said, are intentional. It's scientific, it's analytical, it's artistic. It's not easy to listen to conversations in real time and capture them on a flip chart in a way that's legible and visually appealing, right? And I'm not saying you have a PhD, right? But you do need practice, okay? And we won't see more equity in policies and projects until there's more commitment to and professionalism in the process. Let me wrap up with that. And
thanks. I'm sure we could probably give a date at each of you on this panel, and we'd still come up very short in what you could tell us. So thanks so much for that. And now we're going to turn over to our last panelist, certainly not least, Louis. Please go ahead.
Hi, I think I have some slides that hopefully they can get loaded up. All right, thank you, perfectly. I will apologize in advance. I am the I'm the esoteric academic on the panel. I just use the word esoteric, I prove my point. But anyway, I'm gonna go over some brief background on myself, and then get into some ideas around environmental justice and this JEDI principles. So I'll start with background. I was trained theoretically, so like the theories that I use in my work around risk and risk perception, judgment and decision making, and all this is from a very much a cognitive psychology perspective. And I take this theoretical training and I try to apply it in the context of looking at minority populations, underserved populations, and how these populations interact with the natural environment, and really around an environmental justice context. I go to the next slide. So this leads to my overall research interest, this kind of top line, how I guess the elevator pitch for what I do day to day. This examination of risk perception and decision-making processes and mechanisms in minority and underserved communities in the context of the natural and built environment. So that's like a fancy way of saying that I study what the previous speakers kind of do in real life. So I kind of come behind and hopefully partner with them in different contexts and study how they are making changes on the ground for communities that are vulnerable to these environmental hazards and risk. Can I go to the next slide? And my research goals are really couched in a serious inclusion of the core pillars of environmental justice. And like, you know, depending on who you talk to, you're gonna get different ideas on what environmental justice means. But for the purpose of what I'm gonna talk about briefly is this idea that environmental justice is that we wanna avoid the inequitable distribution of environmental harms and environmental goods to different populations. So traditionally in the United States, populations of color, people of color, underserved populations, poor people have bared much of the environmental harms. So they bear a lot of the environmental risks that's come with our modern technology and modern society. At the same time, they often do not partake in the environmental goods. So they often don't get the best parts of the environment. They're exposed to like the worst aspects, the worst risk, without getting to enjoy the best parts of the natural environment. So there are three ideas that are built into the environmental justice. This idea of recognitional justice, and this is the idea that you need to seriously recognize these populations and recognize that they're experiencing an injustice. And a big part of this is we need to be able to listen to people's pain, and we can't ignore it. And more than just listen, we need to include it into our policy making practices. So that's recognitional justice. This next idea is procedural justice. And we've heard a lot of talk about procedural justice from our previous speakers, because it's an incredibly difficult thing to achieve. And this is the idea that we seriously include voices from these communities and how we develop procedures to deal with environmental harms or environmental waste. And it's really, that's the idea of procedural justice. Then finally, there's this idea of distributional justice. So like, you know, it's great that we recognize these populations and we know and we say that, yes, you're hurting and we're sorry about that and that's wrong. And it's also important that we help them be part of the procedures and the policymaking process to actually deal with the risks that their communities face. But at the end of the day, this last part is incredibly important. There needs to be distributional justice. So we can't just have good recognition, we just can't have good process. We need to see changes in outcomes. We need to see that there's a redistribution of the environmental ills across society in an equitable fashion. So we can't keep having the communities of color and poor people take on all the burden of environmental hazards and environmental risk. That needs to be equitably spread across society. Also, these communities need to have, you know, greater participation in the good parts of the environment. So that's really the core of environmental justice. And before I go to the next slide, we talk about environmental justice all the time. And I think we've really watered down that idea. I mean, environmental justice has been brought into the EPA. A lot of Fortune 500 companies have environmental justice aspects to their mission. If we really want to achieve these ideas of recognitional justice, procedural justice, and distributional justice, it requires a radical rethinking of how we operate day to day. You know, I think oftentimes we don't want to admit how difficult these goals are. But the first step in achieving these goals is admitting that we're very far away from being a just society. You know, and until we recognize that, there's no way we can really get on the path to achieving these other aspects of environmental justice. So I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk more about environmental justice in these different facets in our second hour. So I'll go to the next slide. All right, so I'm a huge nerd, and I think this Jedi, which has kind of picked up speed in the last 3 years, I think part of the reasons we call it Jedi is because people like the term Jedi, and it makes us think about Star Wars and Yoda and Mace Windu and all that. But next slide. When I think about Jedi, I like to actually put the J last and think about these other principles first, and I'll talk about that briefly. So we talked about equity a lot today, and I don't want to retread what we've heard before. It's essentially this idea of equal voice in decision-making process, you know, equitable distribution of resources, and really the most important resource that we need to equitably distribute is power. Because right now, power is often held up in so many different hands, except for people in the community. So it's not just about money. Money's super important. It's not just about natural resources, but it's also about this idea of power. Actually making sure that when someone participates in a process that they actually have direct input on those outcomes. Then there's this idea of diversity. So we definitely need demographic diversity and we need thought diversity. We just can't have one. You have to have both. And there's all types of different facets to demographic and thought diversity. Then this idea of inclusion. And when I think about inclusion, you know, we recognize these diverse voices and we want to give them equity in the process, but we also want to really empower these voices to be part of the policymaking procedures. And what I think we've heard from previous speakers is that often those of us who do this professionally, those of us who are academics like myself, get so caught up in our own rhetoric and our own jargon that we create processes that inherently keep community members out of making decisions. You know, sometimes that's done on accident. I think often that's done on purpose because we don't want to share power. And we don't trust these communities to do what's best for them. There's a long history of that in the United States. So I think we directly have to confront those biases. And finally, I think equity, diversity, and inclusion, that stuff is all great. And we definitely need that. But to me, I think it means very little if we don't have justice. And I think that's a part that we've missed so long in a lot of these spaces. And this is the idea that we have to dismantle the barriers that prevent people from equitably participating in our processes. So like the first thing and part of that is like, we have to recognize that these barriers exist and we have to be blunt about them. And we can't take it personal if we're part of those barriers. We have to be willing to dismantle anything that prevents these communities from really having an equitable chance to participate in decision-making processes around the hazards and risks that they face. And I think that's a really tough hill to climb because it's a very, it requires a lot of self-reflection on what we've done in our own systems and our own agencies. How have we created barriers within our own agencies that prevent these communities from participating, and we don't even recognize that they're barriers? So I will stop there because I know there's a break coming up, and I do not want to go on too long.
It's a great summation and framework for this discussion going forward. I think we may just go ahead and launch right into the question and answer period, but I want to make sure to give permission to folks who are, you know, on the webinar to step away if they need to use the restroom or get a snack, etc. You know, this is being recorded, and I'm sure some of you are maybe watching this in your pajamas from home anyway. So if I could get all of our panelists to maybe turn on their cameras again, I think we'll do it that way, kind of a virtual, you know, horseshoe on the stage, so to speak.
Hey, Jason, this is Sean. Can I say one thing about Slido? So we're going to have the Slido screen up for this section, and I want to encourage everyone to participate with it because we actually have 12 questions already entered in here, but there's not a lot of prioritization yet, and it's possible for everyone in the attendees to just go to slido.com and enter that code that's on the screen, and you will see a thumbs up icon on the right of every question. And if you want that question answered first, feel free to click that button and it'll actually put the prioritization up higher on our list. So you know, it's a really easy thing to go to. You don't even necessarily have to put your own question in if you want to participate. And I also want to remind everyone that if they don't want to go all the way to Slido, then feel free to put a question in the box as well, and we'll be monitoring that.
Great, thanks, Sean. Appreciate that. And that'll, to some extent, make my job a little easier because I can just turn to the questions as they're ranked. But I am going to do moderator's privilege here and ask the first maybe question or two. And I'm going to ask this, I think, to everybody. So there's been a lot, you know, I think everybody touched on this in some way. And I should preface this, you know, Chauncey mentioned that emergency management is, you know, not particularly diverse. I think that's true in the environmental field as well. That's, I think, well established. I suspect that's probably true in some of the more scientific fields as well. And so I guess I have a two-part question for each of you. One, so what are things that we could do to build the pipeline, to get those diverse perspectives into the field? And also, what can we do about the folks who are already in those fields? They're not necessarily going to retire or change careers, and so we want to see these issues. These issues need to be incorporated in all the ways that you talked about. Is it training? I know there's been some discussions that some of the diversity training that folks get in corporate life or even government really don't end up having much of an impact. And so I'm wondering, you can check that box obviously, but that doesn't necessarily guarantee that the person who comes out the other end is going to think differently or act differently. So if you could maybe talk a little bit about that from your perspectives, this kind of pipeline question, but also like moving people who are already in these fields, to incorporate these practices and perspectives. And I'll just start with Andy since he's next in line on the screen for me.
Okay, thank you for that question. And I'm not giving up on training. I think you call Chauncey and tell her to come in, right? And make it a part, like when you're doing the mission, your strategies and everything, make it a part of it, be intentional about it. First of all, we got to decide that it's important. We talk about it all the time, but the people who have the power have to decide that this is important. They don't have to wait, to go all the way back to Rodney King and go all the way. You don't have to. Let's not wait for the next one, the next knee on the neck to talk about this, because if you're on the street, you see it all the time. So it's a part of the decision saying, well, I'm walking in a room, and then I just take inventory, and everybody's Ken and Barbie. It's time to step back. If you go and you're having conversation and there's a whole Ken and Barbie conversation, you need to go and step back. So in our planning process, in our self development, in our professional development, in our community development. And let me tell you, I want to say one more thing, is that everybody who has our skin is not our kin. We have Black folks that need to have diversity training, and we have folks that have been acclimated in certain places and that they've forgotten about diversity. So it's not obvious. And so when it's not obvious, we need to go to academics, we need to go to professional trainers and do self-assessments and put that a part of our strategy.
Thanks, Andy. Myra?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll tackle the first question first. So it was about including more diversity in these spaces. I benefited a lot from a program called the Environmental Fellows Program. I have a public health background, so I did an MPH in environmental sciences. And I am Latina, come from parents who are undocumented. Who were undocumented when they came to the US and all of that. So it's something that I'm very passionate about and recognize the need for people who come from diverse backgrounds to be in these spaces. And I was really thankful to find this program that at the time University of Michigan was hosting. Now it's moved on to Yale, but the whole purpose of the program is to ensure that people that are underrepresented, not just people of color, but also people with disabilities or who might be LGBTQ+, that they're in these spaces when it comes to environmental work. So the program, I think, was really impactful because not only were we placed at different agencies that were either nonprofits or foundations or state agencies, that sort of thing, but we were also able to interact with funders and to get to know how those spaces work. So when it comes to building out pathways, for example, we were able to network, we were able to get training, we were able to just be exposed to a lot of different ways of getting our foot in the door when it comes to this job market. So I think programs like that can go a long way to opening up doors for those that aren't already represented in the environmental space, for example. It doesn't solve the entire problem, of course, but I think when you have people that understand that, first of all, there's a huge gap there, that can provide mentorship. I think mentorship is such a big part of this too, is having people that have come before you that had to go through these really tough obstacles to get to where they are. It makes it easier for those that come after them. So I think programs like those really do go a long way. It does require funding, it requires all the things, but I think the more that you recognize that that's an issue and provide the training and the tools and build out these pathways for underrepresented people, then it does make it easier. And in terms of the second question, I think, I also agree. I oversee 2 leadership programs that I mentioned, so they're training programs inherently. And so I do think it makes a difference. I agree that it has to come from the leadership as well, although that might not always be the case. So sometimes you have to go up against that. But I think a good way of getting around that too is to ensure that in our curriculum, if you're an undergrad, graduate school, where it may be, that's just part of what you're learning. I think, we talked about planning before and how that should be more inclusive, but if you're able to incorporate that into the curriculum that you're learning, that makes such a big difference. I had the benefit of doing an MPH, so you can't talk about public health without talking about inequities and injustices that happen. That's inherent to what we learn, but I know that's not the case for others that go a different route when it comes to their education. So I think that's another way of pushing schools to be better when it comes to that. Because I think once people graduate, if it's already been ingrained into what they've learned, then hopefully they're coming into these spaces, these agencies, these nonprofits, or it may be, and are able to integrate that themselves once they're there.
Great, thanks, Myra. Chauncia?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And I'll be really brief because I know we have a full panel and everyone wants to respond. So I'll just say very quickly, when it comes to developing a pipeline, I'm not always in favor of that because sometimes it's about checking the box, and diversity can lean itself to tokenism and a check the box effect. So if you want diversity, you can have that with, the scribble of a pen, right? It's also about inclusion. Access is not inclusion. So when companies and organizations and different entities are asking for increased representation, I always want to better understand their ability to be inclusive and to provide a culture of belonging. And if that is the case, well, then certainly we can work on increasing representation in multiple areas, but it cannot be a check the box effect or what is typically seen as tokenizing people because of their diverse attributes. We want to avoid that. And the second question is, it was related to, I believe, how can we increase diversity, equity, and inclusion? I think I have that correct. You guys let me know if that's not if that wasn't the right question. But even with that, it's about understanding that we have to normalize conversations about race, about gender, about behaviors and policies that are inequitable. We have to begin to cultivate equity. And many have not come to the point to where they recognize existing inequities and they begin to de-caricaturize people. So some people are living with stereotypes. Most people have biases. There are over 150 different identified biases, and we all operate with those biases. But if you're living with that bias and actually using it to make decisions, to decide who's promoted, to go about your everyday life, putting people in categories, then you are actually harming and diminishing the value of said people. So that's something that we all have to work on. We got to become more comfortable with having those difficult, sticky conversations. And you have to become very comfortable with being uncomfortable, because that's what happens when you're growing and you're learning and you're opening yourself up to new possibilities. And so for those who are in those organizations who may feel like, gosh, my job is going to be sacrificed if I become more open to diversity, equity, and inclusion. My pay, my family will suffer, this will suffer. We have to get away from that and understand that change is growth, and that diversity is going to benefit everyone. I'll stop there. Thank you.
That's it. Ariadna?
Yeah, I totally agree with what was just mentioned. I just remember when Maria hit Puerto Rico, when Hurricane Maria hit, the FEMA officials that came to the ground only spoke English. And I remember that on the streets, what you could find was like the army that, you know, is capable of invading the whole world, but wasn't able to reach the mountains of Puerto Rico, where people was actually like asking for food and for water for weeks and sometimes for months. But I remember that there was just like the army, the National Guard, and also you had like FEMA officials speaking in English. And Puerto Rico has had a long history of political persecution also. You know, it was illegal till the 50s to raise a Puerto Rican flag. And we can talk about it, like, you know, for a long time with a lot of coffee in the middle. But you know, you had people who were unable to understand English, having FEMA officials arriving to their houses, denying them assistance or bottles of water, and you also had the army. So it was a perfect storm to re-victimize people who were already lost everything. So I think that when we speak about equity, it also has to do with language justice, but it also has to do with the way that recovery presence looks when the recovery arrives to the place. Does it arrive militarized? Does it arrive as white men? Does it arrive as, you know, as white U.S. men speaking in English and banging on your door with a piece of paper and asking you to sign stuff in English? That wasn't only part of that emergency of Maria, but it has repeated through the earthquakes of 2020 and now at the COVID pandemic. You know, the language justice issue, having people sign contracts that they don't understand and that, for example, agree to relocations is still here. I would say that, you know, we have to focus a lot, recovery focus, because of federal regulations in LMI, low moderate income standards, but it never speaks about race and gender. And in Puerto Rico, those indicators are always absent. So one of the things that we do is that every single time that we make requests for public information, we ask for those indicators, and the agency goes crazy because that's not something that we ask on a regular basis. I would say that training works. We have done training for recovery for disaster officials, you know, and it works. I used to work with training police against police brutality, so it's not like, you know, it's not worse. So I think that is something that it's possible to do. We also do joint campaigns with people from other places of the island, because we think that regional voices also have a say in the way that equity looks like. Just recovery shouldn't be that like the same recipe for everyone. And I would say about the last part, that the workforce and the way that local capacity is developed when we're talking about disaster assistance, this recovery funds, is also essential. In our case, all of the main companies that were hired are US based. So the money, the recovery funds are going outside. So no resiliency, no capacity for resiliency is developed. So I would say that that is also an area of opportunity.
Thanks very much. Louis.
Yeah, I just want to second everything I've heard. I've been nodding in my head the whole time. Like the language justice is so important, because it's, you know, it's a way to steal something from someone if you want to do it in a different language. But I guess for the first question around the question of a pipeline, I think there's models that already work that we can use, and specifically I think about the 1890 schools and the extension agents that you see in HBCUs. We have for years that historically Black colleges and universities have had this Black extension network that goes out and helps Black and underserved farmers, and they've been critical for helping those communities. So I think we can learn from that type of network to provide, you know, a similar network in terms of doing climate work. And the thing is, like, the pipeline's already there. we have hundreds of graduates every year from historically Black colleges and universities that are trained in this type of work. It's like, I think it's less of creating a pipeline and more of like inviting those people in to do the work that we're doing. I think oftentimes when we create a pipeline, we kind of create a talented 10th idea for, fixing these measures, and we try to find the most talented students who are already at places that we're used to working with. And I think that's not a very good approach. If anything, that replicates the inequalities we already see. So I think we should really make use of the students that we already have. We should really look to our minority serving institutions. And then, how to work with people who are in the field. We're not going to fix this without white people. I mean, it's just a numbers game. We have to get white people on board. And I think Chauncey is right. There's a key for uncomfortable conversations about race and gender in the United States. And we have to make it clear to them that this will help you also. In the last 20 years, white people aren't doing well. The currency of whiteness is not what it was 30 years ago. 30 years ago, you could be a white man graduating from high school and your wife could stay home and you could put your 2 kids through college. You can't do that anymore. Black people and communities of colors have been the canary in the coal mines for America. Now the rest of the country is experiencing the same issues that we have for the last 50, 60, our entire time here in the country. And the question is, are you willing to give up these biases that have held us down that are now starting to hold you down? And these are uncomfortable conversations. And I think people have to get over the fact that they're being attacked. We're not attacking you. We're attacking the mindset that you use to hold other people down that's also holding you down. So I think it's a question of having uncomfortable conversations in really, official places.
Is it okay to say amen?
Amen to that. And I'm hoping that that's a little bit of what we're doing here today. I don't know that there's really been a conversation quite like this at one of these annual meetings before. So last but not least, John, if you'd share your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I just want to make a couple points, pick up on what Louis was talking about, then I'll let you get on to another question. There actually is something called the Extension Disaster Education Network, and there's a network of professionals at HBCUs who are focused on emergency planning. I work with a guy at Prairie View A&M, Noah Leswick. The person at North Carolina A&T is Michelle Ely. Michelle Ely, if folks in North Carolina want to follow up with Michelle. And also, while we're waiting on more white people to come around, in the meantime, Chauncey and I, have the pleasure of working with an organization called the Bill Anderson Fund. I was a founding board member of the Bill Anderson Fund, and it's created to show respect for, remember the legacy of Bill Anderson, who was a beloved member of the disaster research community. He was actually the guy who founded, or was the original manager of the program at the National Science Foundation that funded a lot of the disaster researchers as they started out. And that organization's mission is to increase representation from people of color in the fields of emergency management. So, fund. Look it up.
Thank you very much, John. Okay, well, let's. I'm just so torn because we could have this conversation go on forever, and I want to ask each of you specific questions, but then there's also questions that have come in from our participants who are on the webinar today. So I think why don't we maybe start with that? And the top rated question, has to do kind of how do you get started in this? What's the first step? What would you say is kind of the first step in bringing this process is the right word, but this perspective, and maybe take the position that it's an organization that hasn't really encountered these issues very much. Is it a policy, like asking, and maybe I can pull in from the next question, is it a policy that the local, whatever the elected board is, puts in place? Is it training? Is it setting up a standing relationship with the communities in question? And I think I'll go backwards this time. So John, you're up first.
Yeah, that is a deep question, and I'll just start with, the first step for me is always to find out, who these people are, where they are, and just invite them. I was about to talk about the study that we did after Hurricane Katrina. We looked at 87 counties, the choices planners were making in those counties, and the plans in the Gulf and Atlantic states, just to find out, how are they engaging folks? And one of the things we discovered when we interviewed households was that they didn't know they could participate, largely because they weren't invited, right? And what we heard from emergency managers is that they were hesitant to invite people because they felt like, if they failed, that failure might undermine trust in public authorities. And in my experience, the opposite is true. When you get engaged people in an open and authentic process, they trust you and one another more, right? They're more empathetic towards one another. And when it comes to that fifth stage in the emergency management process, they will come to defend you. You know what the 5 stages are. So there's mitigation, preparedness, response, recovery, and finger pointing, right? And so when it comes to finger pointing, if you have taken the time to build relationships with those folks, they will defend you. They will give you more grace and mercy. I'm also from the country, so getting to know people means going out and sitting a spell. Just having conversations.
Thanks, John. Louis?
Yeah, I'll just build on what John said. I think the first step is develop relationships with these communities and to start to develop trust. I think everyone's going to say that, but the problem is that nobody wants to get off their grant cycle. So like 5 years is not enough time to develop trust in a community and get work done. So that goes back to this, what I was saying before about we need to radically rethink how we do things. We just can't think in 5-year increments. We can't think in 2-year increments. We need to think about in 15, 20, 30-year increments and working with these communities. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Louis. Ariadna? Oh, we lost Ariadna. Myra, then. Come back to Ariadna.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Louis and John both said. I think it is relationship building from the start. And I think, too, the important thing is not going into the conversations, having something in the back of your mind that you need from the community. It's being genuine and just really wanting to talk to people and have a conversation, getting to know who they are, who their community is, like what are the issues that they're dealing with, and going from there. I mean, for us, I mean, we've had to go through with that. One of the communities that we work with is called Overtown, and historically, when you think about a community that's been impacted by environmental injustices, that's been marginalized, that's been underrepresented, that's Overtown to a T, unfortunately. And so I know we had a group of community, well, they're basically community organizers. That's not their title at the organization, but that's what they did. And they just spent, I think, a year just going door to door, talking to people, showing up meetings, not even saying like who they were, just like sitting there and listening to people. And then eventually started to have conversations, eventually started to have meetings. But we knew that in order to do that work, as Louis said, we weren't going to adhere to a strict timeline when it came to grant deliverables, and just had to deal with that and let funders know, hey, like, if you want us to do the work that we want to do, in order for us to do genuine engagement, like this is what it needs to look like. So I think it's also, once you're at that point where you can have those conversations with funders, because it's not always easy, kind of pushing back a little bit and letting them feel it too, because I think we have to change how funding works for this to really work too.
Really good point. Andy?
I think that, we've got to get maybe some internal mantra that, dealing with these issues are going to be messy. And so a lot of times, since we're in a capitalistic society, and sometimes rogue capitalism to a point that we get these habits. And so we get this habit about efficiency. And so instead of dealing with people, we're dealing with customs, how we did it. We're dealing with convenience, we're dealing with class, and we're dealing with cost. And we forget all about care. And so if we decided to center it, like person-centered is what I was going to talk a little bit about today, is that it's not just, let the people who are experts in their misery tell you about their misery and respond to that. They don't take a sabbatical from misery. They don't have to read a book about it. But if we listen and let them be a voice, and they are voices, if we decide to be serious about that, then we become person-centered and we shape those things. We ought to be smart enough that if somebody sends us a chunk of money and some rules, we ought to be smart enough to translate that into some custom-made examples of relieving people's misery.
I agree.
Andy, can you actually just talk a little bit more about what that looks like? Maybe an example from your work?
Okay, so the thing is that, we work with a national organization, and disability rights is a national piece, and they send us these directives, right? And say, this is what you're going to litigate about. You're going to find these class members going to do this, put it in a great package. But then we get thousands of calls a month, right? And so we're getting all these calls that are outside target. Y'all know what outside target is, right? No money attached, right? It's just the people calling you and keep telling you that this is what the heck is going on out here, but I know it's not your target, right? Because you got to wait the next funding cycle to get somebody to pay for that. So what we decided to do is capture the information, because anything that you don't measure, you don't care about anyway. And so a lot of times we don't want to know. So the good way not to know is don't capture it. So we started capturing this information at intake and saying, okay, we're getting X amount of calls for this demand for us. And then we start saying, okay, so who's doing that? If nobody's doing it, we've got to decide there's no wrong door for that, and we need to be informed about that. And so that's why we formed a disaster. We have the only disaster team in the nation that I know of in this disability rights piece, because it was a response to people calling saying, we got all this money, CDBGR money coming, but we got these people with disabilities that don't have access to it. There's a gap there. And so we decided to create that and found the funding to answer the misery. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you very much, Andy. Myra, a question for you. Could you maybe expand a little bit more on the leadership training programs that you talked about?
Yeah, definitely happy to. So Catalyst has a history of doing leadership programs, and we've been doing them for several years. We've done ones that are focused on parents, for example, and building up their leadership, but also welcoming their kids to join as well. I think, Louis was touching upon, I think everyone did, but getting at the obstacles that would keep people from participating in things. So that's one of the things that we do is we offer interpretation in Miami. We speak Spanish and Haitian Creole as well. Those are the other two prominent languages. So we offer that straight from the start, and making sure that materials are interpreted. We offer childcare, which for us means having a youth program. So if you're a parent and you have a 6-year-old, for example, they can take the counterpart program that's youth focused and to their educational level. So that way both parent and child are learning the same thing at the same time, which is really cool and amazing and special, I think. But yeah, there's just like things like that we incorporate into the programs. If people need help with transportation, we try to accommodate that however we can, back when things were in person. So those sorts of things are just built in from the start. So just want to get that out there. If you're thinking of doing programs, like those are the things you have to consider. What would keep someone from taking part in a free program, especially if you're not able to compensate people directly and pay them for their time? What are the other things that you can provide to incentivize them or make it easier for them to attend? So those are some of the things that we do. Now that we're virtual, for example, we have tablets that we'll give to people because we thankfully have a stash of those. We'll give those to people and let them borrow them. And so they can use them however they want for the entire time they're taking the program. So it's an added benefit. So it's things like that you have to think through and try to build into your line items and ensure that you have that built in so you have the money for it. But the programs themselves are during the evening so that people can partake in them if they're working during the day. And they teach people, it's like the climate 101, the housing 101. Those are the two big, when you ask people what they're concerned about, those are typically two of the things that you hear in Miami. So those programs are in direct response to the needs that we heard from community members, the things that they wanted to learn about. So it's also having those conversations like, is this something that you want to learn about? What are the things that you really care about? And so throughout the weeks, they learn about these different subject areas. We have experts like community-based organizations come in, provide, greater context for the work that they do, how people can get involved. They work on community projects where they'll take an idea, kind of doing like a mini grant proposal almost, where they'll choose something that they want to work on. Like maybe it is having a partnering with the Red Cross to do a disaster resilience workshop in their community, something along those lines. And when they graduate, they've learned storytelling, they've learned how to do some more public speaking, they've been building up their writing skills. So it's really like building up the skills that they would need to become, just like better advocates in their communities. And once they graduate, we really try to provide them with as many opportunities as possible to be civically engaged. So that might mean connecting them to the Miami Climate Alliance to join that coalition. It might mean sending out action alerts and encouraging them to show up at commission meetings. So in any way that we possibly can, like make it as easy as possible for people to participate, letting them know what's going on. That's what we really envision the programs working as. It's just creating those opportunities for engagement and to really take what they've learned and apply it in their everyday lives. And typically across the board, we do see that happen to the extent where people even change their career tracks, or now they're working at the Office of Resilience. So we have our people that are educated, that have gone through these programs. So we're kind of building up our little army and integrating people throughout different organizations. So it's pretty amazing. It's pretty impactful.
Thanks, Myra. I'm we're not fortunate to have Catalyst in Broward, but definitely I think we're envious of what you're able to do down there, and we're eager to replicate it or imitate it if we can. Question for Ariadna from the audience. Post Maria, has there been any progress? I mean, have things started to change? Are there any trends that give you hope?
I think that right after Maria, it took a year, but we had a huge win before FEMA to make FEMA headquarters understand that Puerto Rico had other local rules regarding title. And it was a ground also to acknowledge ownership for low-income housing for people, for low-income communities. I think that was a huge win, and we used the experience. We were able to make ties with people in Louisiana and Texas who had been through the same process and the same fight. So that win was huge, and I think it worked maybe to make a stand about how should equity look in the relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States in terms of disasters. As for today, I would say that at least the language justice part has been better, at least officials speak in Spanish. And there is like the inspections are being carried out in Spanish, but the documentation is still in English, so there's a long road to go there. But I would say that the fact that in terms of narrative, people are speaking about just recovery in those terms, just recovery, equitable development. And I'm not only talking about organizations and some agencies, but it's also a conversation that is alive in the communities that we work with. It's a win.
Great, thank you. Louis, you mentioned that a lot of your work is around judgment, decision making, perceptions of risk, that sort of thing. And I know there's been research, and I think it's fairly well established that chronic stress really affects how people make decisions. Can you talk a little bit about that, like how that's maybe relevant in a preparedness or recovery sense?
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. So there's this idea of cognitive capacity. You know, we have cognitive load. So there have been studies showing that the more issues you have to worry about in the background, it reduces your cognitive capacity. So like, you know, we see a lot of this in studies around poverty. So like if you are a child who you're not sure what's the best way to walk to school, because you may have to walk through a neighborhood that may be dangerous for you. If you're not sure where your next meal is going to come from, that's going to impact the way you operate in school. I think we see the same thing happening with a lot of community leaders in small, underfunded communities who are at the front line of climate challenges. I think these community leaders are stretched beyond the limit right now. They have so many things they have to worry about that, you know, we're putting another thing on top of that. So there's a scarcity mindset, and they just don't have the resources to really help them make these decisions. So, you know, I talk about that, but to be honest with you, I often try to avoid, because it's a very nuanced distinction, looking at these cognitive capacities. And my field has a very bad history of becoming very racist very quickly when we look at cognitive capacity. So I think I try to avoid talking about cognitive capacity in a lot of areas because I think it's a very nuanced topic and it's too easy to go down some very racist rabbit holes with it. But I think, you know, at this broader level, community leaders have so many things on top of their mind. And climate change is another one. And they know it's a problem, but they also need people that have a place to sleep at night. They need affordable housing, they need affordable food. And we can see how all these issues are connected, but we also need to create pathways for policies that recognize the connectedness of these issues and don't force them to submit to 100 different small grants to solve each one of these issues. I hope that kind of helps. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thanks, Louis. I just remember reading that some years ago and just finding that to be really interesting. I definitely appreciate the warning about where this can lead. You know, I think that's a bias that, I mean, I'll speak for myself. You know, I work on climate and energy issues, so I assume everyone should be interested in, you know, prioritize these issues. And, you know, particularly people who have 2 jobs and kids and, you know, their house is flooding and they have no AC. They're concerned about all those things well before, you know, something that's kind of this kind of lofty abstract problem, right? I mean, they might see the impacts, but, you know,
Oh,
you know,
I want to be like super clear.
Maybe a stretch. Yeah, go ahead.
I want to be super clear. Like, people in these communities know these issues. They know about these climate issues. And I don't think it's a case of like they're saying it's lower than something else. I think we create pathways for addressing these issues where it seems like they're not prioritizing them. Because, you know, it's easier to get your child into a free lunch program or sign them up for that. What are you going to do to help address it's too hot for them to go outside or there's an unsafe air day for your child? It's just harder to make changes around those issues. So I think I don't want to imply that there's like a nature deficit or a knowledge deficit in these communities. Because I think, you know, Andy and Myra, everyone has already said that like these communities know what's happening to them, but we've just made it extremely hard for them to act on these issues.
Yeah, thank you, Louis, for that clarification. That's a far more elegant way of saying making the point I was trying to make. And obviously, this is the kind of uncomfortable conversation that I need to have so that I can be better at talking about this. Chauncia, can you talk a little bit about social determinants of health and vulnerability and what that means in this context for emergency managers and folks you know, trying to build climate resilience?
Well, you know, it's funny because we just published an article with the topic, why is climate resilience so white? And really it comes from the angle of understanding that a lot of people have been disenfranchised and not included in the concept of building resilience. And it's an intentional construct that's been created to keep people of color and people who represent different elements of diversity to kind of keep them out of that industry. If we think about certain groups that exist, like the Sierra Club and other organizations like that, they're predominantly white, and they do not exude inclusivity, right? So when we think about the social determinants of health, it's more so dealing with the public health perspective. And the CDC has come up with, what we call social determinants of health. And when you overlay those with vulnerabilities within a community, you are provided with a wealth of information that's great for emergency planners. Unfortunately, within the field of emergency management, we do not always consider social determinants of health. We do not consider the lack of access to healthcare, the lack of access to transportation, the lack of access to grocery stores. There's an initiative happening right now in Florida where they're using Publix grocery stores to provide vaccines. I think it's in Florida and Georgia, maybe one other state. But there's not been any discussion about the fact that Publix stores are not located in low-income neighborhoods. So now you have a situation where the dominant population has access to vaccinations, and those that are in majority minority or low-income areas, or areas that have been historically disenfranchised or marginalized, red line communities, they do not have access to vaccinations. And so back to Louis' point of not oversimplifying the cognitive ability. And I've seen that messaging, by the way, where people are saying, well, people of color just don't trust the medical system, so they don't want to get vaccinated, and therefore that's why they haven't been vaccinated. That is not true. The fact is that there is a lack of access to the vaccinations. And so, yes, there is distrust, but survival and life safety always take precedence over that distrust. There have been many things, many times that people of color have had to trust the medical system to protect themselves and their families. And so this is another instance where the messaging has not been equitable. The resources have not been dispersed equitably, and there's been a lack of concern about ensuring that all communities are included. And had the social determinants of health been used, we would not see the disparities in treatment and in vaccination distribution that we're seeing now. So I hope that answers the question.
Trustee, I know that's a very current example, and it's in the the newspaper and the news here quite a bit.
And she gets an amen.
We need a little button on the go-to webinar for that. So John, kind of wrapping up these individual questions with you, can you talk about that demonstration program that you mentioned?
I'm going to turn my microphone off, and it looks like I'm having some bandwidth issues, so I'm going to turn my camera off. And you still hear me, right? Okay, yes. So the Emergency Preparedness Demonstration was that project that the Congressional Black Caucus got the appropriation for. It was a $2.5 million effort focused on 8 states along the Atlantic seaboard that were impacted by Hurricane Isabel. And again, their issue was to try to get some understanding of the barriers to increase disaster awareness and preparedness in what they call marginalized communities. And we, at the time I was working at MDC, which is a nonprofit organization based in Durham, North Carolina, with a long track record that stretched back to the civil rights era of leading community-based demonstration projects. And I wound up at MDC after finishing my PhD. I said that one of the things I concluded in my dissertation was that even when emergency managers believed in the efficacy of inclusive planning wasn't something that they knew how to do. And I wanted to turn my dissertation into a guidebook for those folks so that they could learn how to do it better. And then I realized that despite all the time I'd spent hanging out with environmental justice advocates, you know, my Jedi masters, Louis, I wasn't quite yet a master myself. So I wanted to go someplace and learn how to become a skilled community builder. So I wound up at MDC, and we got the project, and we began by forming teams in the places that we worked, right? And we were intentional about the work of identifying a diverse group, building trust, helping that group come up with a shared understanding about their context, and taking data that we gathered from formal sources and validating that data with Indigenous knowledge. You know, I never forget, I tell the story a lot, but I never forget one of the places I worked in was West Virginia. And I got to West Virginia and I was giving a presentation on the demographic profile for West Virginia. And I was talking about the percent of people of color in that West Virginia community. And it was something like 0.6% or something like that. And before I could finish, someone raised their hand and said, no, that family moved, right? And so the moral of the story is, you know, sometimes the data that you get from formal sources is not always accurate. It's insufficient, it's incomplete. And so when I talk about respecting Indigenous knowledge, that's an example of why we do it. But we formed those teams, and we had conversations kind of grounded in the local context, respectful of Indigenous knowledge about where they were, where they wanted to go. We informed those conversations with data from, you know, again, from formal and informal sources, and then we tried to come up with the most promising strategies for that place, recognizing we say promising strategies instead of best strategies because you know, what's good in one place might not be good in another place. And you know, I didn't mention, I don't know if it was in my bio, but one other responsibility I have at the university is as a professor of the practice in the Department of Landscape Architecture and Urban Planning. And I help manage the capstone courses for the graduate and undergraduate students. And so my role is to train them on how to be better problem solvers for their future constituents and clients. And I help connect them to opportunities to get hands-on experience. If we have more time, you know, my experience in the emergency preparedness demonstration helped me come up with some rules of thumbs that I teach my students. But you know, as far as takeaways, let me just say this: one of the things that I learned in that project, and I've heard Andy say it, I've heard Louis say it, I've heard Chauncey say it, is that, you know, despite what people think, you know, lay people, when you give them access to technical assistance, they can receive and analyze technical data, and they can make wise decisions in light of that data. Right? They just need to be engaged, brought into the process.
Thanks very much, John.
Yeah.
Amen.
So, amen. So we're coming up on the top of the hour and the end of the panel. So I'm going to ask a closing two-part closing question to each of you, and see if you can get through it in 90 seconds. So one, there was a question that was submitted, and I'm kind of taking some liberties. But if you had sort of one resource that you could point folks to that you think would be beneficial, could you mention that? Book, film, websites. Obviously, everyone's going to visit all of your web pages and such. But in addition to that, so a resource, and then also if you could have folks leave today with one takeaway, what would it be? Start with you, Andy.
Wow. The resource, I think, is I think people have to get some self-awareness. We went through the book as a book club, Me and White Supremacy. I think I was counting this lady out, this author out, because she didn't live in America, didn't have the slavery experience, but she articulates some language and defines some terms that I think are important, great handles. The takeaway that I'd like to say, and I'm a pastor, okay, and my job every day, day in and day out, is to change people's value system. Is that I've got to teach people to care for people who are others until others become their brothers. And if we could decide that we can put people first on our value system, rather than our efficiencies, our customs, or what we did yesterday, or our come-froms, if we could decide that we put people first in that value system and keep them first, the people that we said that we're serving, be in integrity with that, and make sure that we extend our care and value to people.
Myra?
So I'm glad I'm going second because I don't know if someone else is going to say this before me. But I think my go-to is always the HEMES principles. So I'll give people homework. If you aren't aware what that is, look it up. It's JEMEZ. HEMES principles. But basically, it's a roadmap of how to do democratic organizing. So read through that. Ask yourself, are you doing this in your work? Are you doing this as part of the organization you're at, wherever that may mean for you? And just spend some time reflecting on that. Because I think once you ask yourself, like, are you being inclusive? Are you working in solidarity? Are you building just relationships? Once you start to ask yourself those questions, it becomes apparent like where you need to do more work. And I think for all of us, it's always a learning experience. You know, if you work in the space, I don't claim to say that I do everything perfectly or always manage conversations the correct way. Like that's part of, you know, having conversations. Sometimes it's not always easy when you're talking about justice and equity. So that's my recommendation in terms of a resource. And the second thing I would say as a takeaway is just to really honor people's lived experiences. I know I mentioned that already, but I just think it's really important to recognize that, you know, when you're talking to someone that has been living through climate change here, for example, Miami, like they can tell you where it's been flooding down the road. They can tell you exactly like where an engineer should go and build whatever it is that's needed or build green infrastructure to solve the issue. So I think oftentimes, like I mentioned before, we're relying on outside expertise when it's already there in our backyard. And it's important to have community members really show off what they know. And like I said, they know what they want to see. They know the solutions that would make sense, that would work for them. So work with them, give them the opportunity to say what they want to see so that when you're spending this money, sometimes a gargantuan amount of money, that it's actually going to good use and that it's something that people want to see and will help their lives be better.
Thanks so much, Myra. Ariadna?
I would say as a major takeaway and also as a resource, I would say that placing humanity in the center of the work that we also do with the people that we accompany, but also understanding our own humanity, understanding that it's a tiring work, you know, to do disaster-related work, and it also has to do with our own humanity, with being parents or being people who care for others or being survivors of disasters ourselves. And I wanted to recommend something that we have been using, and it's the Adrienne Marie Brown's Emergent Strategy. It's an amazing book if you haven't read it. And it's a book about how to center strategies that actually work and how to show up. So yeah.
Thank you so much. Louis?
Sorry, it always takes me a while to find that mute button. So in terms of a recommendation, I think in general, Americans don't know a lot about their history. And also, when we say people of color, I don't like saying people of color. I'm going to focus on Black people. So like, you know, let's just focus on Black people. And I think the book that I would recommend would be, I want to get the title correctly, is Reconstruction Updated, America's Unfinished Revolution by Eric Foner. And I recommend this because Reconstruction is this period in our country which I think is incredibly hopeful. We have people 5 years out of slavery serving as senators, running their own communities. And I think it really shows that these communities can do this. They can make hard, complex decisions, and they've done it in the past. But this book also shows that America has systematically taken away power from these communities, made it where they don't have voices. So I think this book is incredibly powerful because I think there's a message of hope there, but there's also a message, a warning that America has systematically done this to these communities. And if we're not intentional about reversing that, we can go right back there. So I highly recommend it. And also Eric Froner's just an amazing historian. It's fun to read. If you have kids, read it with your kids, so your kids can learn about Reconstruction, because I guarantee you they won't in school. It's like 2 pages in your history book. And then I think, my final takeaway message, and I've touched on this multiple times, is like, and I know people will feel attacked, but we have to be willing to reject this notion of whiteness in America. And I don't say that just to white people, I say that to Black people, because often Black people subscribe to notions of whiteness. We have to be willing to reject dominant social notions of power in this country, because it's not just hurting Black people, it's hurting all of us. So I think, I really challenge people to be self-reflective and think about how they are contributing to systems of oppression, because we all are. And I think once we start there, we can start making these outside differences.
Very much, Louis.
I have to go, but I just want to
Shanti,
say,
yes, please.
yes, I just wanted to say, I think the best resource, the best tool that anyone could have is a mirror. Do some self-reflection, understand where your biases are, and understand how you are actually attributing those biases to other people and to other situations. So be cognizant of that, and also allow yourself to be stretched and to go beyond the limitations that you might have come up with growing up, and go beyond that and work every day diligently to make the world a better place for everyone, not just yourself and your family. All right, take care.
Thanks,
I'll talk
Chauncey.
to you some other time. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, bye-bye.
And John, you want to bring us home here?
Oh, I tell people that I only work in places by invitation. It's hard to foster change in places that are not ready for it. And usually when someone or a place invites me there, it usually means that they're ready to start doing things differently, right? They recognize that the way that they've been doing things for generations is not working for everyone, all right? And change is a verb. It can't be delivered overnight. One other thing, I always tell folks, don't court politicians, right? Politicians will show up eventually. Once you start to build some trust and gain some momentum, they'll want to show up and take credit for it. So that's one thing. But and my resource is the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. I serve on the advisory board for that. It is a kind of a think and do thought leader for disaster grant making, and a great resource for people that want some support. Not saying they will give you a grant, but I mean, in times after disaster and leading up to disaster, they might be a great resource for building equity.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you all so much. If we were all in person, I would encourage everyone in the audience to give a round of applause to you all, and to Chauncey and Myra, who had to step off. This was a tremendously illuminating discussion. I know, at least speaking for myself, and I think others probably agree with me. And I wish we had much more time for this. And as John just said, this change is a verb, and so it's not like we stop today after this panel and we want things to be different. We have to make them different. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Barbara and introduce the last part of the meeting. Thanks, everyone.
Hey, y'all, we're just going to have a few moments, but it sounds like we need a follow-up webinar on this for sure, maybe sometime soon. I think there's enough interest there, and we never got to all the questions. But thank you, panelists, and thanks, Jason and Sean, for managing everything else. This has been an incredible series of sessions, and we're going to wrap up with Jennifer Klein, who is on our advisory board, and she, if you were there for the first session, she's also with the Department of Natural Resources and with Georgia, but she's going to tie us up with or wrap us up with a few concluding statements and take it from there, Jennifer.
Thank you. Did you happen to have the slide? I only had like 2 slides.
Okay, let me find that.
Well, I'll go ahead and get started while you pull that up. First of all, I would like to thank Socorro, Barbara, the conference planning team, and my fellow steering team members. What a great conference. You know, I've thought a lot about resiliency these last 3 days. We have heard about state, federal, local projects, businesses and private sector achievements, NGO tools, and efforts to include at-risk communities. These great projects show a commitment in and around our region to creating resilient people, place, and our planet. Yes, we have a long ways to go, but wow at the strides that we have made. When I looked up the definition for resilience, there were numerous explanations. In the simplest form, it is the ability to recover from or adjust to misfortune or change. Can you advance that, Barbara, to the next one? Thank you. When I think about a great example of resiliency, I think of the SCDRP. Let me tell you why. If I tried to give you the history and a list of the acronyms that this partnership has held, we would be here another day. What is important for you to understand is that we are committed to the cause. We are family. We are persistent to thrive as a partnership, and we want you to join us if you haven't already. As Barbara mentioned earlier, we have a new strategic plan posted on the website, and we are reaching out to all presenters, moderators, and attendees to consider becoming a member. If you are interested and willing, please contact Barbara. I have conveniently put her contact information at the bottom of this slide. I challenge you to continue your leadership. It so results in one life influencing another. And with that, I will just say thank you, and I hope to see you in person at next year's conference. With that, thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thanks, everybody. Have a great weekend. Be safe out there.